All right, hello and welcome to the Off by One security stream. And this week I've got a special guest, Jean-Francois Mays, who is joining me from Belgium currently, right? I think you're moving, but you're in Belgium now?
Correct. Yes, I am moving, but it's probably going to take a few more months to actually get there. I'm going to Portugal, but yeah, bureaucracy is kind of a pain in the ass. So, but I'll get there. I'll get there.
Nice. So this week we wanted to talk about red teaming. So I've been doing this stream now for, I guess we're going on 2 months, and I think we've done about 6 or 7 streams. And most of the content's been extremely technical, I guess, compared to a lot of the streams out there and a lot of the videos you find out on YouTube. And it was kind of by design. I really wanted to bring content that is not often covered. If you look up something like buffer overflows, for example, on YouTube, there are hundreds or even thousands of videos. It's been done over and over again. And I even had, after I started the stream, some people reaching out and saying, well, we still want you to do a buffer overflow video or something. And it's kind of like, okay, I'll do one anyway. But regardless, some of the streams I want to do are those where I bring on experts and we can chat about how to get into a particular topic area or area of expertise in security. And just, if you want to make the jump from, let's say, pen testing over to red teaming, for example, in this case, or if you want to make the jump from basically any industry area and just go straight into something like red teaming, how would you go about doing that? So the reason I brought Jean-Francois on, or asked him to come on, is a couple reasons. One, he is the author of a new SANS course called Red Team Operations, and it's a 500 level course, 6 days long, focusing on that he co-authored with Barrett Darnell, another author at SANS. And so that's one reason. He wrote a course on the topic. Another reason is he used to work at Inviso out of Belgium with Eric Van Buggenau and a bunch of other experts, offering everything from product security testing and red teaming over to incident response and other expert areas as well. So he's got a lot of experience doing that in practice, and was, and maybe still is, you can tell us, Jean-Francois, doing some work for Trusted Sec, and now primarily at help systems working on things like Cobalt Strike. So obviously, if you're into red teaming, you've heard of Cobalt Strike. So why don't you give us a little background to kind of like where you are now?
Right. Yeah. So thank you, first of all, for the introduction, Steve. You kind of almost hit it right on the point. So very good job there. Yeah, you're right. I'm still doing some occasional work for Trusted Sec, but that's definitely not my primary job anymore. And besides, I never really did a lot of red teaming work for Trusted Sec anyway. Trusted Sec work was more internal pen testing. So really, my red teaming expertise comes from my time at Inviso, and it's kind of interesting that you prefaced this podcast, this live stream with, "What if you just want to get into red teaming?" Because that's kind of the road that I took with Inviso. When I joined Inviso, we were still very small. I think I was employee number 31 or something. And when I left, I was there were 150 employees. So tremendous growth. But over the years that I was there, Inviso also kind of grew as a company, not just by attracting new people, but also just expanding their services. So when I joined, red teaming wasn't really an offering that they had per se. So I kind of helped shape that service line, if you will, and then ultimately ended up leading a few red teams there as well. So yeah, pretty awesome that I get to be here on the stream with you and talk about that, because I basically experienced that. I went from having pretty much no pen testing experience to having some, to then effectively leading red teams. So that's where I came from. And right now, indeed, I am working with the Cobalt Strike team, help define the roadmap, do some work, research work for them as well, and also teaching SANS. So there you are.
I guess one big question people often ask, at least when I'm teaching or having conversations, or I've heard it elsewhere, is what is the difference between pen testing and red teaming? Because they're similar in some ways, but there's clearly some very distinct differences. So what would you say there?
Correct. Yes. And it's kind of a topic that is still very much alive, even in the red team community themselves. So the out of the box answer, or the boxed answer that you always get, is, well, pen testing is trying to identify as many vulnerabilities as you can, guns blazing, and just present your findings to the client in a way like, okay, I found this many vulnerabilities, I popped your domain, I got domain admin, etc., etc. Where red teaming is more of a surgical approach, where you come together with a client and actually asks the client like, hey, what keeps you up at night? Like, what is the worst thing that could happen for you in a business scenario? Like, do you fear like people are going to steal data? Do you think like in case of a bank, are you afraid that some malicious actor can transfer funds from one account to the other? Could be personal data in case of hospitals, etc., etc. So the scoping kind of changes in like in the industry that you're performing a red team, whereas in a pen test the scope doesn't necessarily change. It's like, here's the infrastructure, just try to find as many vulnerabilities as you can, try to exploit them. Whereas red teaming is really like mission oriented. You actually have to get after some goal, the crown jewels, if you will, or the objectives. So it's more of an objective based approach where you also not only test the technology, because in a pen test you're just basically testing the technology, right? You're just trying to find flaws in software or misconfigurations. But in red teaming, there are other aspects as well. For example, you might try to get in using social engineering techniques. So it depends on the people that are actually working for your organization, like how good are they at spotting a potential fish? Do they report it? And you also kind of want to test the defenses as well, right? Because if you are doing a red team and let's say that you are super elite, super ninja, got under the radar for everything, and then conclude the exercise without triggering any alerts, then really the defensive capabilities of that organization hasn't really been completely tested or validated because they never saw something pop up. So they never actually had a jump scare, had a response. So you don't necessarily know what that's like. So it's really a combination of a lot of things. You only you do objective based, like you have a goal and you're testing multiple aspects of an organization.
It also involves a lot of times like adversary emulation, right? Or would that be more
Right.
triple
Yeah.
teaming? Or yeah.
Correct. No, you're absolutely right, and that is where the debate kind of originates within the red team community itself. Like, what exactly do we do? Do we really do threat intel and then just completely copy paste like TTPs, or do we do like a variant and do we like slide in our own tradecraft and get the objectives that way? So there's a lot of speculation and a lot of different niches in red teaming. It kind of depends on what your customer wants as well. So there's a lot of variance within the red teaming community itself as well, if that makes sense.
So do you think the transition between traditional pen testing, like if you've got experience doing pen testing and you want to go into red teaming, is it pretty natural? Like what would you need to go and brush up on and prepare on and study? Like how do you get from one to the other?
Right. So that also really depends on what you want to do. Because red teaming is quite broad as well. Just like InfoSec is quite broad, red teaming in itself is also rather broad because a red team usually is exactly that. It is a team. So you actually have a lot of people with a lot of different skills. You could be a red team manager, which means that you're going to have a lot of customer interaction, right? But you could also be just an operator who knows the tradecraft, knows exactly what Windows or Linux or Mac, depending on the organization, how it operates, like really down to, okay, what if I execute this command? What would trigger in the background, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, you have malware developers as well, because, well, buy versus build, right? A lot of organizations, especially mature red teams, have their own research team or at least malware developers that create their custom malware in order to try and bypass some defenses. So it depends on what your goals are. But in general, it really makes a lot of sense as a red teamer, no matter where you are in the spectrum, to have intimate knowledge of the operating systems that you're targeting, to have some knowledge of defensive capabilities as well. And that was something that I struggled with when I first started red teaming, because I never was in a scenario where I have been in a SOC before, so I never really dealt with defenses in that sense. So I had to learn all of that by myself and just by talking to my colleagues at Inviso who happen to be blue teamers. So those two things are really key. And a third thing potentially, which is nice to have, but not 100% necessary, because again, it's a team game, is if you have knowledge of networking in general, like you know how a network works, you know what a router is, you know what a switch is, that also will help you, because sometimes you'll try to lateral move to something and it just won't work. And you'll be like, why doesn't this work? It should work, but it could be that, for example, it just gets blocked on a firewall level. You just didn't think about that.
Yeah, for sure. And then you made me think of something, which is this week, actually, I've been sitting a new class that Jonathan Ryder just created
Right.
on basically offensive tool development on Windows. And it's a red teaming course. So you brought up having like a custom malware group. That seems like an area where if you can get some development skills and you can actually go and modify, because I would imagine that most of the endpoint detection type products out there detect all the default stuff out of the box. Like, you know, if you launch a Meterpreter even against a target, it's going to get detected. So having the skills to be able to create the custom implants has to be desirable. Is that a pretty common thing in red teams, or is that like not often seen?
Correct. Yeah, you're very right in a sense. Again, it's more of a buy versus build thing that a lot of shops have. So you do have the off-the-shelf command and control frameworks, right? You have the free versions like a Covenant, like a Meterpreter, like a Sliver, even Havoc that was released just recently. But you also have the more commercial side of things, like Cobalt Strike, like Nighthawk, like Brute Ratel. And depending on your price point, and again, how much in-house talent that you have, you might want to prefer one product over the other. For example, if you just buy Cobalt Strike and you expect Cobalt Strike to just function out of the box, like clickety, clickety, click, you're going to have a bad time, because that won't work. Cobalt Strike has been signatured like hell. It's probably even more signatured than Meterpreter, if you believe that. So you will have to have some knowledge. At least some people in your team have to have some knowledge in order to adapt Cobalt Strike, in order to bypass defenses. You could also go for additional tooling, right? You could, for example, purchase a packer that will do some obfuscation for you in order to try and bypass things. You could, for example, purchase the OST tooling that Outflank have, which is like an addition to Cobalt Strike, or you could purchase Nighthawk or Brute Ratel, which promise out-of-the-box evasion. But then again, how long will that last, right? Because at some point, it's always a cat versus mouse game. So at some point, you might have an operation where even those things get caught. And then if you have to wait until the upstream fixes the problem for you, you might lose valuable time. You might waste dollars of your clients. So having the skills to adapt publicly available tooling, be it either commercial or just open source GitHub tooling, is definitely something that would be desirable. Yes.
And what is, like, for something like Cobalt Strike, what does that look like? I mean, is it you're creating a payload and you need to go in and what some people refer to as like ghostwriting and such, like open up an assembly and make some changes to it to get around the signature detection? And I guess a two-part question. So one, does tools like Cobalt Strike and others have the ability to go in and make those changes, and what does that look like? And then also, is the problem more around like the pre-processing that's going on in these detection suites that are focusing primarily on signature-based stuff? Like, would behavioral detection fix that?
Right. So again, as you said, twofold question, so twofold answer. First of all, in terms of Cobalt Strike, because you essentially called out Cobalt Strike, there are ways for clients to actually modify pieces of the Cobalt Strike code without actually having access to the full code. So those are dubbed Gits in the Cobalt Strike world. So if you have a license, you can download additional Gits. And basically what those are just C code that you can modify, and that will get plugged into the payload generator in the backend. So if you modify a kit, then load the script to actually say, hey, I now wrote this patch for that specific thing within Cobalt Strike. Then the next time you generate a payload, it's going to include your patched code instead of the boilerplate templated code. And that way you could try and evade some detections. And your second part of the question is, yeah, a lot of the EDRs and endpoint security are still very much signature based. So you could bypass a lot of things by just, like you said, hot patching some things. That said, though, it's not because you get a callback from an implant, it's not because your beacon calls back that you can actually operate. So on multiple occasions, multiple red teams, we've had Cobalt Strike agents, Cobalt Strike beacons call back to our team server. But the moment that we actually try to interact with the beacon, it died. So there are there is behavior analysis as well that you have to take into account. And if I can, I would like to share something real quick.
Sure. We love demos. Yeah.
Well, this is not the demo yet, but there is a nope, that's not it. There's actually a GitHub repository from Elastic, which they released not that long ago, actually, called Protection Artifacts. And Elastic actually did the community a favor, and they published their Java rules for malware protection, but also their behavior analysis rules as well. So if you, as a red teamer, are interested in some of the rules that you might want to potentially bypass, let's just take the first one. This one says, command and control connection to dynamic DNS providers by assigned binary proxy. So if you actually look what this does, it's going to check these specific processes, and then it's going to check whether these specific processes do a DNS action against these domains. Mm-hmm. So from an adversary point of view, this is interesting, because if you can avoid these binaries, or you can avoid these domains, you essentially bypassed what this is called like a behavior rule, right? So if you take these into account, if you know these exist, you might actually already bypass a lot of products. Yeah, there's a ton of them out there, like defense evasion, parent process ID spoofing. So there's a ton of them out there already freely available to you. So if you know these exist and you are a red teamer, it's in your best interest to actually go through these rules and be like, okay, this is my test plan that I have. This is what I want to execute. Will any of these rules that are publicly available catch me or not? And if so, can I do something to potentially bypass this? And well, because I'm already sharing my screen, I can actually go into a demo as well. So there's actually a YouTube video that was posted by John Hammond. And this was posted on the 20th, so like a week ago. And he goes into how hackers hide. And essentially what he says is, hey, I wrote this script called envy.py. And what it does is it's basically going to abuse the fact that Windows has wildcards, and it is able to interpret wildcards. So I could potentially create something very obscure and try to bypass defenses that way. So I spun up a lab environment. This is actually the environment of the 699 SANS course. And what I essentially did was I have this install util, right, which is a binary that is living on a Windows system by default. So I didn't really have to download anything for that. And if I just do the wildcard thing like this, if I just invoke it like this, it's going to give me the output of install-util.exe, just like I would basically type C Windows Microsoft.NET Framework install util, and that works. So that was kind of interesting, because I, as a red teamer, thought, okay, I'm able to make this work. How could I, what does this look like from a blue team perspective? Does this bypass any rules or not? So in our lab range, we actually have sysmon running on all these boxes, and sysmon is going to send the logs to an ALK stack. And essentially, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy paste this query in there, which is basically going to search for process create events and any process create events that were, for example, install-util.exe. So I am specifying install-util.exe with the full name, and I do see that it hits. So I was kind of curious, what does the command line actually look like from a sysmon perspective? And if we look here, it actually is capable, it's smart enough to unravel itself to see that this is indeed install-util.exe. So in terms of bypassing a defense, this is actually quite nice, right? I mean, it's a nice idea, But in reality, in practice, it doesn't work, right? Because we just saw that Sysmon was able to like fully get this command line. So that's interesting, right? And these are things that a red team operator have to take into account. Like you see something new on Twitter or on YouTube and you are like, okay, this sounds cool, but will this actually work in an operation? Some people would just brainlessly or foolishly think, yeah, this is going to work. They would execute it, they would get burned, and they were like, okay, why didn't this work? So my suggestion, or one of the tips that I have for people that are in the industry and looking to get into red teaming, is build a detection lab. There are some open source alternatives out there already, and just start playing with the blue side of things. Like try to hunt for your own artifacts, see what those look like, and try to identify behavior that you could potentially bypass. Another thing that I want to show here is, for example, a one of the easiest things, or one of the things that red teamers do the most, is to get in, right? To get initial execution, is send a malicious payload in the form of, for example, an Office document, right? That's something that we had a lot of success with in the past. So something very basic that we could do is, well, first I need to actually get that developer ribbon enabled so I can use macros. Developer, okay. Developer, there you go. Is this actually in the right machine? No, it is not. This is on the attacker machine. I actually need to go into one of the student machines. So hold on.
Yeah, no worries. I always prefer live demos. That's what I always do. Versus, I know, so there's the demo gods. We all know the demo gods, which are there to like destroy and wreck your demo and embarrass you.
Right.
But
right.
then some people are like, well, I've got a solution. I'm going to record a video of things working perfectly, which is a great alternative, especially if you're under a time constraint. But
Right.
actually live demoing things and running into some of the problems and mistakes like everyone does, even if it's a typo, I find those to be incredibly useful and helpful for people.
Right. So one of the mistakes or things that I'm having now is the fact that I can't seem to get into the actual environment. So that's pretty cool. Okay. The VPN is live, so I should be able to get into this. Yep, that seems to work. Yeah, I want to sign in anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting what you were saying before.
Okay, this is the student machine. Anyways, yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, going in, like you were saying, going in and setting up a lab and testing the techniques. I mean, so many people, and I'm not picking, of course, you know, especially when you're first getting into any area like this, you tend to use the tools and you hope that things work out of the box, like they say they're going to work, and you put a lot of trust in what people say. But then getting more mature and going and actually testing the things and understanding how things work under the hood, down at the system level, like that's what really takes you to that next level.
Yeah, for sure. So here we have just the VBA editor within Office, right? Where adversaries tend to like to drop their payloads. So here I have this super basic sub.auto-open. So this basically executes whenever a document gets opened. And essentially, we're just going to spawn PowerShell and echo out hacked. So if I would run this, PowerShell will spawn, and we do see that hacked here. And now, of course, this could just be a PowerShell downloader as well, right? To set up a command and control, which would be effective as well. Now, the downside of this approach is what we do here is we have Office, we have Word, in this case, spawn a new process, PowerShell.exe. And that's not something that happens very often, right? In a normal day-to-day operations, Word that is spawning PowerShell is not something that happens very often. Now, if we, as blue teamers, for example, would want to hunt for this, we just, once again, search for these event ID 1 process create, and this time we are filtering out the parent has to be words. So if we would update this query, we get 2 results because I'm specifying 1 or 4688, which is basically mirror images of each other. One is Sysmon, the other is Windows security event logs by themselves. And if we actually look here, we see that indeed PowerShell got spawned and the parent process is WinWord. So that's not something that is very like desirable. So what we could do is there's this macro from Christophe D, which is, I think, a French security researcher, and he created a VBA macro, which basically does process parent ID spoofing. So we could select an arbitrary parent that we want. And it also does command line spoofing. So we could replace the command line with something benign looking. So if you would copy paste this into our environment, so we get rid of this macro and we paste in this very long one instead. We have this auto open. We click it. It actually overflows. Oh, that's interesting. Never seen that before. Maybe it's because the wrong architecture. Let me try and see if the 32-bit version would make more sense in this case. Nope. Huh. Well, seems that one's broken. That's cool. Interesting. Well, okay, that one doesn't seem to want to run. But the interesting part here would be that we basically open a handle to explore.exe and then use that handle in the open process call, in the create process call, sorry, to then effectively spawn PowerShell under explore.exe. Then if we would search for it in our Elastic Stack, we would actually not see it being spawned from WinWord, but if we would filter out for Explorer, then we would see a new PowerShell prompt being spawned from Explorer instead of PowerShell. But Explorer spawning PowerShell is a lot more legit than Word spawning PowerShell. I think everyone would agree on that.
So does that require admin rights or anything like that? Is that something that could?
No, that would require just the regular user rights, because you only need to open a handle to Explorer, and Explorer is just a process that any regular user can open a handle to. It's not something that's running in an elevated context, so that should work. I don't know why it isn't right now, but yeah.
Yeah. If you're going to show anything else, if you could increase the font or zoom in a little bit, some people are saying it's hard to see the font. But yeah, like what you're showing there too right now, because exactly one of my points from earlier, a lot of times when you go and copy and paste someone's code, like it worked yesterday, it doesn't work today. So like having the ability to go in and debug the code and getting good at scripting and learning different languages is another thing that's like immensely useful. Like these are things that set you apart from your average pen tester or red teamer.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. I'm just going to try it once again, but if it doesn't work now, which I expect it wouldn't, then I'm just going to leave it here. Now, as we talked about getting into red teaming, right? One of the other things that you kind of want to know is the fact that as a pen tester, you are not really going to deal with a lot of command and control channels, right? Because as a pen tester, you usually either are on site and can just interpreter all the things, or just use the tools that you're familiar with. As again, you're not really testing defenses at that point. From a red teamer perspective, chances are very great that you will need command and control channels, because you are probably going to infect multiple machines during your engagement. And if you, for example, would use Meterpreter and infect everything with Meterpreter, it would be pretty wonky to try and manage all those sessions, right? So there are command and control frameworks out there, like Covenant, for example. So I have this one open because we use it in the course as well. And essentially, what this allows you to do is it has a nice front-end interface. In the case of Covenant, it's a web application. We have a tab called Listeners here, and in the Listeners tab, we could essentially open up a port and listen for incoming connections. So if we do that here, we fill on the IP address. I'm going to take port 80 here. This is not by accident. I want to talk about one of the things red teams should actually pay attention to. So I'm going to just use HTTP. I'm going to create this listener, and it basically tells me, okay, this listener is now active. So I'm now listening for incoming connections on port 80. Then we have another tab called launchers. And in this tab, we can create a runner, if you will, to actually run our payload to get a callback into our command and control, and then to use the command and control to actually perform commands on the system that we infected. So we could opt for a PowerShell launcher, for example, and it has a kill date, which is quite handy because this kill date allows you to be very ethical and to be safe, right? You could set your kill dates to the end of your engagement, and then you are 100% sure that even if cleanup would fail for some reason, those malicious payloads are not going to call back anymore because they have an effective kill date, so they are not going to do any malicious things after that date. Here, I now, for demo purposes, set it to 2025. Obviously, you want to pick something more realistic in an operation. We have this generate button, and then we get this nice launcher that we can copy paste if we want to. So if we would do this into our machine, there you go. Wow. Okay, copy paste isn't working. Okay, there we go. Okay, PowerShell disappears, and we should get a new grunt. Yep, we get a new agent, and that's pretty cool because now we could, for example, do very basic, who am I? And if we now wait a few seconds, we get back the user that we are. So pretty cool. And this allows us to control multiple computers, infected computers, in a way that is very manageable, right? Because we see like a nice front end that we can use to interact with our agents. Now, the thing is, you don't want to use HTTP. That's something like, I see some red teams, like you said, Steve, out of the box tooling, not thinking about anything, just blasting and just hoping that it works. Well, if you, for example, would use HTTP and you start looking at the traffic, so destination, what's the IP again? 107. Okay.
It's funny. So many people are successful when they do things like use port 80, and they think, "Hey, it just works." It's like that's because the security monitoring is so poor at some organizations. Like some pen testers and red teamers think they're moving through a network like a ninja. But if you have a good SOC or a good forensics person look at the mess you left behind, you're actually quite loud.
Exactly. So here you're going to see something that would stick out if a blue team would like do some analysis, right? If they inspect the traffic, what's going on here is we see hello world, hello world, hello world. If we see like consecutive requests, like hello world, hello world, hello world, hello world, like a ton of hello world, like this isn't normal at all, right? This doesn't make any sense. So people would really start to be suspicious on what the hell is going on.
Is it doing that to try to like make itself look like normal web traffic?
Yes. Yeah. This essentially tries to make it look like normal web traffic, but it's not doing any randomization or anything like that. So you always get the same like static answer back. So it doesn't behave like a normal web application would. Now, Covenant does have the possibility, even though it like you don't see it, because when you create it, you have this listens on HTTP protocol. So it doesn't essentially say HTTPS, but you have this use SSL true, and then you need to feed it your own SSL certificate, but you can generate that yourself pretty easily with OpenSSL. It can just be self-signed. And then if you specify 443 and again the IP address, we should get another listener that is active. It should activate at some point. Anyways, you get a new listener that is using HTTPS. And if you use HTTPS, it would be encrypted. And that brings me to another point that red teamers sometimes ignore. And that is that a lot of organizations actually have SSL offloading, which means that they are able to decrypt SSL traffic. However, like law, like mandated by law, they are not supposed to be able to offload SSL traffic for finance, personal finance, so banking, and personal health, so anything that is going with hospital related matters. So if you, as an adversary or a red teamer, register a domain that you're going to use as a command and control domain, and you recategorize it by all the major proxy vendors like F5, like Blue Coats, you recategorize it to health or to finance, you actually get the categorization right, then you should be golden, because they
Yeah.
should not be able to decrypt that traffic. And of course, if they can't decrypt the traffic, they can't snoop around. So even if you would use Covenant in its default configuration, which is just the hello world, hello world, hello world, it's going to be encrypted, and no one is actually going to be able to see the messages that are being sent over the wire, if that makes sense.
That's actually a great tip. That's awesome though. Yeah, it's a good idea. Register is something that they're going to get in trouble for if they look at it.
Yeah, exactly.
Teddy asks, when in a red teaming operation, would it be necessary to write your own implants? Is it such a skill beneficial? Is such a skill beneficial given modern red teaming software? Like,
right. So we briefly touched upon it already during the talk that we had, but essentially, if you either have one, the capability to write your own implant, or B, the capability to modify existing implants, like you have the low level knowledge to modify codes in, for example, assembly, or if you have the opportunity to get like the generated code in C, for example, and you have C skills to modify it, then that will greatly help you bypass modern defenses. Now, as I said, there are command and control frameworks out there like Brute Ratel, like Nighthawk, that promise evasion out of the box, and they will do a good job. Probably, I haven't used them before, but they will probably do a good job. But essentially, like machine learning and things like defenses get smarter as well, right? It's always a cat and mouse game. So it's eventually something is going to get burnt. And then you have two options. If you didn't have the knowledge and you just bought a out of the box evasive solution, you have to wait until the developers publish an update to try and bypass whatever defense is now catching them. And that could cost you time, right? Because developers probably have their own dev cycles and it's not going to be immediate, right? They're not going to patch things immediately. So if you have the skills to modify it yourself, you will not lose any time, and you will have a more return on a better return on investment, because you're only going to use your own modified payloads in your engagements. You're not going to open source them. You're not going to distribute them to other paying clients. So the footprint of your own custom tooling is going to be smaller, which means that there are going to be less samples out there, which means the shelf time of your custom malware is going to be longer by definition than anything that is available to you, either paid or even open source. Does that make sense?
oh yeah, no, that's a great answer. Thanks. And yeah, like you said, we touched on it a bit. And I mentioned before too that there's a course running this week I'm sitting the alpha for, which is pretty neat, going through that exact topic area of customizing things yourself, because it certainly is an acquired skill set, something that you really need to want to do, but that makes you so much more valuable as a red teamer, and you know,
for sure,
increases your resume for sure. I guess I don't want to take up too much longer of your time, but like another question I had, or I guess maybe we'll end with this one. What do you see about the, I guess, the threat landscape, the defensive landscape, like where we're going in the future? Do you see it getting a lot harder? Because I can tell
yes,
you, with regard
yes.
to exploit development,
Yeah,
things are a lot harder than
yeah,
they used to be.
yeah.
And so I guess,
Yes, I 100% assume that it's going to get a lot harder. And essentially, when I left Inviso, we hired someone new, a very talented individual who's actually going to speak at Hackfest this year as well, Sander. And I, like, the last thing that I said before I left Inviso was to Sander, and I said, "Hey, if you have the skills or you want to do the research, start researching kernel exploitation." Because I feel that within the next 1, 2, 3 years, a lot of our tradecraft is going to depend on, first of all, finding vulnerabilities in some driver or bringing your own vulnerable driver. and then using the kernel memory, which is shared, right? So using the kernel memory to suppress hooks from EDRs or to poison telemetry that EDRs have. I think that's definitely going to be the way forward. As I said before, defenses get smarter, especially Microsoft, which has like unlimited telemetry, right? So their defender for endpoint is scary, very scary, and it's it picks up on new tradecraft very fast as well. So yeah, essentially to once again answer your question, I think it's going to get a lot harder, and I think a lot of tradecraft is going to potentially boil down to kernel exploitation and just using the kernel as a new playground.
I can say bad news, but the kernel, especially on the Windows side, is just so ridiculously hardened now. If you look at Windows 10 and 11
Oh, yeah.
and all the virtualization-based security and all the mitigations that they've added with code signing, and I mean, the day of like code execution in the kernel that's a really, really rare thing to get. And the read-write primitives are still potentially there, and you can do things like privilege escalation here and there, but code execution's gotten so hard, especially with things like the control flow enforcement technology. And a lot of that's like some hardware supports it and the operating system supports it, but Microsoft, for example, can't flip that switch and just turn it all on by default because it'll break so many systems or applications out there. But some point in the future, that stuff's going to get switched on. I guess the last thing I'll say is, I mean, with keeping that in mind, so what you just said about the kernel side of things, you're getting into an area where the skill set to be able to do that type of thing is hard. It's really hard. So do you see, I guess, it's still being possible to do traditional red teaming and still get value out of it and still be able to do things if everyone were on Windows 10 or 11 fully patched with all these mitigations? Or are there still going to be opportunities, or are you?
Yeah, I think that there's always going to be mistakes that are made by driver developers, because even drivers get developed. Developers are usually human still. There's no machine that is, well, maybe in the future, but we're still human. We still make mistakes. And there's a nice project called KDU. I don't know if you know about it, Steve. It's called Driver Utility, I think, on GitHub. And essentially, it's a collection of signed drivers that have vulnerabilities in them.
Yeah.
Which basically allows you to load them. They're signed, so even with security controls in place, code signing requirements, etc., you can still load them and then abuse them to get read-write primitives in kernel land. So I think that maybe finding new vulnerabilities inside the kernel itself is indeed going to get a lot harder, or potentially even fingers crossed for defenders out there, impossible. But drivers that are being developed by reputable vendors can still contain flaws. And if you find flaws in those things, it's again game over. So yeah.
Yeah, and unfortunately, for the attacker side, there's always going to be outdated systems. I mean, so many people go and focus on ICS environments or academic environments or other areas like healthcare where there's outdated systems running. There's always the world of Internet of Things, and there will always be opportunities. But this is what happens when you shine a bright light on the problem with the lack of security for a couple decades, and now we've got millions of people have influxed into security, and they're fixing the problems, which is what's supposed to happen. So it's good and bad, right?
Correct, for sure. Yes.
So, but cool. Well, I really appreciate you joining me here, and hope to have you back again. I think you shared some really cool tricks and tips there. That's some awesome stuff, things I didn't know. And join me next week. I'm going to go over a kind of introduction to the Linux heap. I know a lot of people who are familiar with like stack exploitation and how those exploits and stuff work. I'm not really going to get into heap exploitation. I'll talk about some theory, but I really want to focus on how the heap works, what dynamic memory looks like, and things you have to know, how you maybe debug it. And then a week after that, so 2 weeks from today, I'm having Connor McGar on to talk about some of this kernel stuff that we were just talking about. So nice. Hopefully we'll get an update as to where things are at and where they're headed with regard to kernel exploitation and mitigations.
All right. Awesome. Thanks for having me, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Talk to you soon. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.